Spaghetti with meatballs. The choice to make this dish revealed a very gruesome crime. It was just an ordinary late afternoon, and a woman was deciding what to make for dinner, so she decided to make spaghetti with meatballs. She went to the fridge to get the ground beef, but realized she was out. Then she remembered that actually there was plenty of meat in her house. A few weeks earlier, an acquaintance of her husband had shown up there asking for a favor. This friend's power had gone out, and he showed up with a freezer full of meat, terrified of losing all his goods. He asked his friend if he could store the freezer in his basement. The friend agreed without a problem, so the freezer had been there in the house ever since, just sitting quietly in a corner. And when the woman realized she was out of meat, she thought, why not go there and borrow a little bit of meat? I'll replace it later, and no one will even notice. She went down the stairs, got close to the freezer, but then she realized there was a problem. The freezer was locked with a padlock, and she remembered at that moment that the guy had even asked no one to mess with the freezer. But thinking it wasn't that dangerous, she said, you know what? I'm going to try to open this. To be honest, I think curiosity got the best of her there, so she started messing with the padlock, grabbed a screwdriver, unscrewed it, and the thing opened. She then lifted the lid, and an overwhelming smell of meat hit her. Actually, it was a sweet and rotten stench, sauté, that even sticks to your throat. She peeked in and saw some black trash bags tightly tied and also a bucket. I don't know if she had any idea what she had just seen, but right away she got a strange feeling that something was very wrong. Right then, she closed it and went upstairs. She waited upstairs for her husband to arrive so they could return and open it together, and she could tell him everything. The fact is, by this point, the spaghetti with meatballs, yeah, that wasn't gonna happen anymore, right? Well, when the freezer was opened again, that whole story about being afraid the meat would spoil just fell apart right there. And that's how, with the choice of dinner dish, the police in that little town got the call that would break the case wide open. A case that had been going on for months. Right under everyone's nose, including the very family of the woman who was inside that freezer. A woman who, for months, hadn't even been treated as missing and had only officially come onto the police's radar a few weeks earlier. Now that I've described that scene, I'm Marcos Campos. And today, I'm going to tell you the story of Shannon Graves, a woman who died but remained alive for months. People kept getting replies from her phone, her car was seen driving around the city, her card was being used for shopping in several places, but none of that, obviously, was Shannon. It was a macabre act set up by people who, after taking her life, still tried to use the traces she left behind to convince everyone that she was still around. And if you like real stories told like this, with lots of details, consider becoming a member of the channel to help me with the productions. Every week, at least 3 new episodes here. Given this information, let's get to the facts. The woman who didn't disappear. To understand how that woman ended up inside that freezer in the basement of someone who had nothing to do with her or this story, we need to go back about 5 months earlier in this case and go to Youngstown, Ohio. The victim's name was Shannon Graves. She was 28 years old, and around February 2017, Shannon just sort of stopped, you could say. She stopped going to family events, stopped showing up at work, disappeared from her friends' routines, from daily life, from everyone who used to be around her. In any normal situation, when someone close to you disappears like that, it's an immediate red flag, isn't it? But in Shannon's case, no one was really alarmed at first because there was an explanation going around to justify her absence. That explanation came from her boyfriend, the man she was living with, actually. Every time someone asked about her, he would say the same thing, with a little variation here and there, but basically that the two of them had broken up and that Shannon packed her things and moved to Cleveland, supposedly to be with another guy. Later on, he changed the story. He said she had left for Columbus to be with another guy. And look, as strange as it may seem, the family had reasons to, let's say, go along with that version of the story, or those versions. Shannon, as far as we know, was someone who liked to live freely, had lots of friends, the kind of person who would disappear for a while and then show up again, you know. Her life hadn't been the easiest either. She had lost her mother, had gone through a rough patch, but she was turning things around. She had just graduated from cosmetology school and was excited to start a new career in the beauty industry. So, the idea that she had packed her things and gone to start her life over somewhere just like that wasn't all that unlikely to happen. But there was a detail that confused everyone. Shannon, even without showing up in person like at a family gathering at work or hanging out with colleagues, she was kind of still around the city, you know? She kept leaving traces. Her cell phone was sending messages just fine, her card was used for several purchases, and her car was seen driving around Youngstown. So for the family, it all seemed normal, simple. She just wasn't showing up. Why? Apparently that was just her style. But that was exactly the trick, the problem. The thing is, Shannon wasn't starting over in another city at all. Her life was being controlled and run by other people. As if someone had left only her shell there, just functioning to fool everyone. The family went along with it like that for weeks, until one small thing started to reveal the real story. A detail that couldn't fit with that story, which we now know was false, that Shannon had simply left to start her life over. The detail, her little dog. Shannon was obsessed with Molly, her little dog. People who knew the two said that she would never, under any circumstances, leave that animal behind to move to another city, for example. She would take the dog with her, no matter what, and Molly hadn't gone anywhere. The little dog remained in the same house as always. But now, under someone else's care, for the family, that was a detail that just didn't fit at all into that story that had convinced them for a while. Shannon suddenly moving away for some reason and leaving her phone and car behind, okay, but according to those who knew her, she would never abandon her little dog. And that was exactly what ended the sense of normalcy in this strange story of Shannon disappearing and still showing up indirectly in June of 2017. And notice that at this point, it's already been about 4 months since the last time anyone actually saw Shannon anywhere, okay? That was in February. Her sister then, during that period in June, Debbie, went to the Youngstown police and reported her sister missing. She and Shannon's ex-fiancé started looking on their own, going door to people they knew, asking questions, gathering whatever information they could. On the other side of this story, her boyfriend started to, let's say, slip up in his bizarre little plan. This boyfriend, by the way, wasn't exactly a saint, okay? He already had a criminal record and was always involved with drug trafficking. Just to give you an idea, in April, a police officer in Youngstown tried to stop him during a routine traffic stop. Instead of pulling over, the guy just took off in the car, there was a chase, he abandoned the vehicle along the way, and even tried to run away on foot until he was restrained and arrested. At the time, it was just another guy running from the police, right? No one connected that to Shannon. But looking at this episode now, you can see the man getting more and more nervous, anxious about something, right? Making more and more mistakes. Well, it was in June then that the police really opened the investigation into the disappearance, 4 months later. And 4 months, needless to say, is a long time, isn't it? But they were being fooled by a plan set up exactly to fit what everyone already expected from Shannon, you know? After all, ordinary things seemed to prove that she was really alive. Like I already said, it was all an act, but just wait and see. In the end, it wasn't the police investigation that, let's say, set off what would blow this case wide open, okay? What opened everything up was a woman who just wanted to make dinner. And then well, to go back to that scene that opened the episode, right? The freezer, the woman opening it, that sweet, rotten smell. I need to talk about the favor that was done, right? Let me tell you more details about that part of the story. Well, the house where this freezer ended up was in Campbell. It's a small town right next to Youngstown. The owner of the house was an acquaintance of Shannon's boyfriend. The two of them had gotten closer years before because of music, apparently, Shannon's boyfriend. He liked music, talked about recording some rap tracks. They weren't really friends, okay? The two of them. That makes it even stranger, I'd say, because of what he's about to do. I'll tell you in a moment. Anyway, The owner of the house actually thought Shannon's boyfriend was kind of weird, kind of unpredictable, sometimes even aggressive. But when he showed up with the story about the power being out at his house and the freezer full of meat about to spoil, it seemed like a simple request. So simple that he had no way to refuse or suspect anything at that moment. I mean, he actually could have, because look, the guy took the freezer to his friend's house. It wasn't like he just showed up at 5 in the afternoon, knocked on the door and said, "Can I use your electricity? My power's out. Let me leave the freezer here." The guy brought it over in the middle of the night, man, around 3 a.m. with the help of 2 other weird guys. He padlocked everything and told everyone not to touch it. The lucky part, if you can even call it luck in a story like this, is that he was kind of clumsy, you know? The padlock was installed kind of wrong, upside down, which made it easier, for the lock to be opened when the woman got curious and went to see what was inside. And then what I told you about happened, right? She opened it with a screwdriver and there was this strong smell, a bucket. Inside that bucket, a human foot. And they called the police. The forensic experts then arrived at the house and went to check the freezer, right? The freezer. And they realized there were human body parts in there. 2 arms, 2 legs, and a foot. But the torso was missing, and there was almost nothing left of the head. Just a piece remained, What was left of that part of the head was totally destroyed. Part of it was corroded, And that's exactly when the investigation hit its first big problem. With the body in that condition, the medical examiner couldn't determine how that woman had died. In a violent death like that, the marks that tell or could tell the story, the fractures, the signs of trauma, physical evidence, they're there, right? The traces left in the organs are usually found in the head and torso. And that's exactly what had disappeared or been destroyed. The limbs were left, which were enough to identify the victim, but not to determine how she had been killed. Whoever did that, whether on purpose or not, had erased the answer to the most important question of all. How did Shannon die? But the body, even though it was incomplete, as I said, still had 2 ways to identify who it was. The first was a scorpion tattoo on one of the feet. And Shannon, who was a Scorpio, had exactly that tattoo in the same place. The second thing that confirmed the identification for good was the fingerprints. There was no more doubt. The body in the freezer was indeed Shannon Graves, the young woman who, according to her boyfriend, had simply moved to another city. But before going after whoever had left that freezer there, the police had to rule out the obvious, right? After all, the freezer was in the house of those people who called the police. Like it or not, they had to dig around a bit, investigate to find out, right? These people who owned the house were suspects, right? On the suspect list. So both of them were taken aside, separated from each other, each one telling their own version, and both versions matched perfectly. No gaps, no holes, right? Without those contradictions that give away a lie. So, in the police's mind, there was no way that could have been their doing. They were just an ordinary couple who had really made the mistake of being too kind to the wrong person. The police released the 2 and turned all their attention now to the only question that really mattered: who brought that freezer to that house? That's when the pieces start to fit together. The freezer had been left there by a man who introduced himself as Anthony Gonzalez. But when the police went after this Anthony Gonzalez, they discovered that the name was fake. It was the nickname the guy used to hide himself. And this guy was already on the radar. Of course, he was Shannon's boyfriend, right? The man who kept saying she had left. Actually, his name was Arturo Novoa. So they took him and the woman who was living with him in for questioning, and they went to search the apartment where they were living. I'll explain to you in a moment who this woman living with the girlfriend's killer was. What did they find in that apartment? It said a lot, okay? There was blood on the wall. There was an instruction manual for the same model of freezer where the body was found. And on Arturo's own keychain, the police found the key to the padlock on that freezer. All of this after he looked at the detectives and swore he didn't know anything about that freezer. It seemed like the end, right? Case closed. They had the body. They had the identity. They had the main suspect who lied about the victim's whereabouts, blood, manual, key, etc. It seemed like the case was ready for prosecutors to file charges right then, but there's always more, isn't there? Because when the police took a closer look at the woman who lived there with Arturo, the case stopped being just a murder and became one of the most cruel, macabre, and disturbing things those investigators had ever seen up to that point. The second woman. The name of this second woman was Katrina Litton. She was in her early 30s, was the mother of 2 children, and already had a history of an on and off relationship with Arturo. It had been going on for years. But for this piece to fit properly in the case, you need to know what Shannon, the victim's relationship with Arturo, the killer, was really like, okay? The two had met in April 2016 and quickly started a relationship. By September, they were living together at her place. But behind closed doors, the relationship was terrible, explosive, and he had a history of being violent with Zeno. At the end of 2016, they even broke up and Arturo went to live with another woman. It lasted a week, and in 7 days he was already back at Shannon's place. And this other woman, the one he ran to that week, was none other than Katrina. So you can see that she was kind of his anchor, right? When things got heated, there was Katrina who would, let's say, take him in. Now pay attention to what this woman did, okay? Because from here on, this story stops being just another murder, like I said, and becomes one of the coldest and most calculated things you'll hear about in this case. About 2 weeks after the last time Shannon was seen alive, Katrina moved into the house where Shannon used to live. And she didn't just move in, okay? She started driving Shannon's car, started using Shannon's cell phone. It was probably her who was sending those messages back then. Just think about that. And she kept on anyway, using Shannon's benefit card to go shopping, took care of Shannon's little dog, Molly. She, let's say, didn't just take Shannon's place as the guy's girlfriend. Katrina put on Shannon's life like it was an outfit and spent months parading around Youngstown in it. It was exactly this act that kept the missing person report from being filed for so long. As long as Shannon kept shopping, driving, texting, no one was really going to look for her. And what was happening to Shannon during that time is the most grotesque part of this case. So hold on, because this is the reconstruction that the court itself pieced together, step by step, okay? On February 24, 2017, inside the house where the two of them lived, Shannon, guys, Arturo beat Shannon to death. In the bathroom, he struck her in the head several times with a heavy object. She lost her life. From that moment on, a long and increasingly grotesque operation began to make that body disappear. An operation that dragged on for months and across several different locations. First, he shaved Shannon's head. He wrapped the body in garbage bags and, with Katrina's help, put Shannon in the trunk of her own car. Then, they took the body to Katrina's house. It was there in the garage of that house that a third person came into the picture, someone Arturo knew, named Andrew Herman. So the two men decided to dismember Shannon's body right there in the garage. They separated the arms, legs, and head from the torso. The arms and legs went into one box, the head and torso into another. And why would Herman agree to take part in something so monstrous? I'm sure that's what's going through your minds. So, he wasn't just some stranger who showed up to lend a hand in this case, okay? He and Arturo were already close buddies from their drug trafficking days, you know? In other words, they were two lowlifes who already had a lot in common. And another explanation for why Herman did that in the garage would only come to light much later in court, okay? And I'll get to that part in a moment. Well, those boxes containing the body parts went back to Shannon's house and ended up in a freezer. The first freezer in the story. And here's the part that shows how much work they had to do to cover all this up. Because it didn't stop at the dismemberment, okay? At the beginning of March, Arturo called a friend who also lived in Angstal and asked if he could build a bonfire in his friend's backyard. Now that seems pretty strange, right? Someone randomly lets another person burn things in their backyard. But first, let me give you some context. For the homeowner, there was nothing unusual about it. Backyard bonfires are actually pretty common there, okay? He just had no idea what Arturo was planning to burn there, right? So Arturo brought Shannon's clothes, documents, the hair he had shaved off, a bracelet of hers with her name engraved on it. And he threw everything into the fire. But the bonfire got so big that even the firefighter showed up to ask if everything was okay. The next day, the people living in that borrowed house, right, who were friends of Arturo, they went to poke around the ashes of that bonfire. And they found in the middle of the soot the bracelet with Shannon's name on it. Then it started to sink in, right? The night before, they had seen Arturo and Katrina throwing a bunch of bags into that fire. From what I can tell, they didn't take part in that little bonfire, okay? It was just that guy. I don't even know if it was a recreational bonfire or if they just lent the backyard for the guy to burn some of his stuff. Well, the homeowner got suspicious, so they went over there, sifted through the ashes, and kept what they found. And then everything they kept was handed over to the police. But before we continue with the investigation, there's another part I need to tell you about, which is the part about the acid. They ordered 12 gallons of sulfuric acid from a Walmart store. But they placed the order using a fake name, which was Chicken Man. Then there was a little problem, right? Because when they went to pick up the order, the employee there refused to hand over sulfuric acid to someone registered as Chicken Man without real identification. So to take the acid, Katrina had to show her real documents, pay with her own card. I mean, everything was recorded, right? With her name card, so they were basically building the evidence right there by making up this bizarre chicken thing, right? And that's where everything fell apart too. And in short, guys, for a duo that was trying to pull off the perfect plan, right? To make the body disappear without leaving a trace, let's just say it wasn't exactly the work of a genius, right? Well, they brought everything here, and they dumped it on top of the box that had Shannon's head and torso, okay? Most of the torso and skull kind of dissolved in the acid there. The piece of skull that was left was thrown in the freezer along with the arms and legs, and that's how the body stayed inside that freezer in Shannon's own house until June. The months went by, and Arthur, Katrina, and her 2 children just went on with their lives as usual until the family finally reported Shannon's disappearance in June, as we saw. And Arthur realized that sooner or later the police would show up at his house, and that's when he came up with this macabre plan for moving the body around. So Katrina rented an apartment in another area of Youngstown. Arthur bought a second freezer. He took what was left of Shannon's body out of the first one. He put it back in the trunk of her car and took it to that rented apartment and put it inside this new freezer, okay? And there's a detail to all of this, okay? When the owner of that property started to realize that actually no one had moved in there, it was rented but no one was living there, he went to take a look. And the only thing inside the apartment was a freezer, the appliance's warranty manual, and a black suitcase. They had rented the whole apartment just to hide the freezer. Actually, he hid the body, right? Well, when the police finally got the warrant and searched the house where Shannon had lived with this guy, Arthur panicked again, and it was exactly at that point that he called his acquaintance from Campbell. That whole story about the power going out, right? About the meat that was going to spoil. He asked to leave the freezer there. Then he went over there, and he left the freezer locked, etc., which I already told you about. And then everything unfolded, right? I didn't tell this in chronological order. But if you start putting the pieces together, you start seeing a series of big coincidences there that start coming together, right? The links in this criminal chain. Now, there are some complicated legal details in this kind of case, you know? With everything the police already had, the body in the freezer, the blood, the acid bought in Katrina's name, right? Convicting those people there for hiding, destroying the body, it was practically certain. They weren't going to get away with that. The problem is that hiding a body is a crime. Killing is another, much more serious one, right? Much harder to prove. And it was precisely the murder charge that depended on a missing piece. The proof of how, by whom, Zenia had been killed. Without that, there was a real risk that they would only be charged for tampering with the body and get away with the charge for the death itself. And what unlocked that part was that nasty little group finally talking. You know when the heat is on and people start talking? So the creepy little group started talking. Called to testify before the court, those involved started turning each other in. And the one who gave the missing information was exactly the man from the garage, that Andrew Herman guy. Remember him? The one who helped dismember the body? That's right. He was the one who told the investigators how Zenia had been killed. According to the prosecutor on the case, Herman was the only one who actually explained how she died. In court, Herman's lawyers argued that he only agreed to help dismember the body because he was terrified. He had just seen with his own eyes what Arturo was capable of doing. So he got scared and said something like, "Damn, if I don't help this guy, he's going to kill me too." And Herman's testimony had an effect that no one expected, okay? It broke up a deal that was already being put together. Because Katrina, by that point, had already worked out a little deal with the prosecution to turn everyone in. And let's say it was a scandalously generous deal in exchange for testifying against Arturo. She would only get probation, not a single day in jail. And it wasn't just a theory, it actually worked. She was even released in 2018 while the case was still ongoing. Shannon's own sister, outraged, called it a complete absurdity. But Herman revealed and showed that Katrina had lied about her own role in the crime. Shannon's family then filed a formal complaint against that agreement, and the case ended up in the hands of the Ohio State Attorney General's office. The judge reviewed everything and tore up that agreement. That's when the real consequences came. Arturo Novoa, the man who killed Shannon and led months of cover-up, pleaded guilty in 2019 to homicide and dozens of other charges related to destroying and hiding the body. The sentence was 48 years to life in prison. In other words, he'll serve at least 48 years. Katrina Layton, after her deal fell through, was sentenced to 18 years, and at the hearing, the prosecutor said a phrase that sums up her role well, okay? It may have been Arturo who killed, but it was Katrina who led the cover-up. She was the one who helped carry Shannon's body parts around the city while literally living the life of the woman who had been murdered. Andrew Herman, the guy from the garage, got 12 years, and his wife? That's right, folks, there's another person involved in this whole mess. Michelle was convicted of intimidation and obstruction of justice because she lied to the grand jury about what she really knew. She also sent a message threatening a witness cooperating with the police. She had already spent almost 2 years in jail while the case was ongoing and being investigated, and then she got another 6 months in prison plus 5 years on probation. A total of 4 people were held accountable for this bizarre story. But justice in a case like this always comes too late and never feels complete, isn't it? Shannon's father was a former police officer in the city of Youngstown itself. In the middle of this whole investigation, with the case still dragging on, he suddenly died at the beginning of 2019, months before the man who killed his daughter was convicted. So, he didn't see any of the 4 pay for anything, and because of the acid and what they did to the body, there was practically nothing left, right? Just some pieces that were recovered. Shannon's sister summed up how sick this case was in one sentence: she would only be able to bury a piece of her sister. But there's a part of this case that no sentence can fix either. Besides the rotten character of these people, it's exactly that. What was taken from Shannon after she died, the family's right to say goodbye to her intact. In the following years, Arturo filed appeal after appeal, tried to annul his own confession, tried to overturn the sentence, claimed everything you can imagine. He lost them all. He's still in prison, and Katrina is serving her sentence too. And Shannon's little dog, Molly, unintentionally, there's even a certain irony of fate there, a kind of poetry, right? If that's the right word. She was the one who started the chain that led to a real investigation in this case, wasn't she? Besides, of course, the spaghetti and meatballs recipe. A coincidence that deep down wasn't really much of a coincidence, right? It ended up solving this case. Now I'm sure you must be wondering why this happened, right? Why did Arturo do this? And look, the most honest answer, which is what the prosecutor himself said, is that the reason is as tangled as the whole story. There wasn't a clear trigger, you know? Like, this happened because of that. That's what the prosecution said, right? It's that Arturo was a mediocre, jealous drug dealer who envied what Shannon had, her money, her things, and they were already in a pretty complicated relationship that already involved violence. And there's Katrina, right? Katrina was Arturo's anchor, like I said, and she was in love with him. She wanted Arturo just for herself. So it's a whole mix of different reasons, right? What you can sum up is that the crime was really driven by coldness and pettiness. In fact, when they asked Arturo why he hadn't gotten rid of the body, maybe in a lake, he said that the body would definitely float and he would get caught. Deep down, he never regretted it and was only worried about saving his own skin. Now tell me here what you thought about this story. And there are other really macabre and bizarre cases here on the channel. Keep binge watching and tag me on your social media so I can see it, okay? A kiss from the redhead. Thanks for the company. See you next episode.